Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox. This is the third part of manufacturing history, and in these episodes we're going to talk about the things that we are doing and how we are responding to what we are hearing. And one of the big things that we're going to have to talk about here is sanctions. We've talked a bit about sanctions already during this video. We talk about a lot of sanctions like a form of economic warfare, and in general, we think about economic sanctions. But sanctions that are intended to have broad and crippling effects on an economy are only one type of sanction. And they're also the one that is most damaging to innocent civilian populations. This is largely a class of sanctions that we'll be talking about in this video series. You can't starve a nation's economy without also, in some ways, starving its people. But there are a lot of tools in the sanctions toolbox. It's not entirely what we usually think about. Like when I was mentioning Afghanistan and the Taliban, seizing funds that are being held, or denying access to things that underpin whole economies, like banking systems and credit processing. Towards the beginning of this crisis, sanctions like these were considered to be more of a nuclear option. Though that phrase has considerably less meaning in a context where one of the countries involved actually does have nukes. I'm just saying there's less civilian blowback from targeting companies and oligarchs specifically, instead of trying to aggressively rug pull the entire Russian economy overnight. I gotta say though, we really escalated the scope of our sanctions a bit quickly. At the same time, it didn't necessarily have huge immediate negative effects either for us or Russia, but there could be retaliation that comes once these sanctions starts to bite. And it's not like this wasn't something that we talked about the first days of this crisis. And in ways, it definitely escalated, and at least escalated our involvement in the situation. And that is absolutely one of the concerns with sanctions: retaliation and escalation. Putin is a proud leader, but he's very dependent on poll numbers, along with crushing his opposition to remain in power. This is already an incredibly unpopular war for him. And one thing I haven't heard anyone mention pertaining to it, that it might actually hurt his re-election chances for a fourth term in 2024. I mean, this is a little ways in the future, so maybe no one's thinking about that now. But it is also worth noting that Russia has a 2-term presidential term limit, which Putin personally bypassed in 2020 thanks to a constitutional reform that made it through just in time to see him elected for a third term. In the eyes of Russian customs, he's already overstayed his welcome. With us pushing his economy to failure, we risk not only giving him a foreign scapegoat for the ills of the Russian economy, but also pushing him to make a big move that might help him recover his bravado in the polls. We can see it already. The longer this drags on, the more brutal and desperate his tactics become. He can feel his facade of a strong Russia beginning to crack like a paper tiger before the eyes of the people. I mention his pride because he's unlikely to back out without losing his political mandate to lead, or until there's a silver lining that he is likely to push his own people to the brink of starvation to achieve even a Pyrrhic victory. And until one of those things happen, he is very unlikely to admit defeat. He's very likely to only end this with negotiations that give him something of a win in return. Something he can take back to the Russian people to bolster his chances of winning a fourth presidential term. I mean, I get why people don't talk about Russia in this way, because we think of Russia as being a dictatorship. And it is in practice, but it is also in practice democratic. And I'm not saying that the elections are fair, or that, say, his chief opposition isn't in prison right now for telling people to speak out against the war, or just generally from having the balls to oppose him. I'm just saying that it is possible that the Russian people say no to Putin in 2024, that 3 terms was enough if this is how he was going to use them. I like the idea of keeping other options open and being able to find diplomatic solutions. Something like offering to allow Russia to join NATO as an interesting diplomatic option that might diffuse this situation, though it's nowhere on Russia's list of demands. But I still think it would be a smart move to offer. And for a lot of the same reasons that the USSR tried to join NATO, I think this was prior to the beginning of the Cold War, because they were effectively doing it as a way to kind of test whether or not this was an anti-Soviet alliance, figuring that, if they were denied entry, it would be proof that it was an anti-Soviet union. And if they were allowed entry, well, they had potentially neutralized an anti-Soviet union. But I do think that with, so many of Russia's demands or justifications centering around NATO, some of the ones that are accepted most around the world, I think that this would be a really interesting way to go at this. And again, maybe I don't quite get how that would backfire, but at the same time, I think it would preclude them from a lot of the brinksmanship that they are currently doing. I don't know. If you have more coherent thoughts on that, drop them in the comments. I'd be happy to read through them. But I'm not necessarily seeing a drawback here. But the thing you have to remember is that sanctions are still a form of warfare, even if it is typically thought of as a cold or benign one. And to remember that war is essentially, when you boil it all down, rich and powerful people economically opposing other rich and powerful people using their civilian populations to attempt to make other civilian populations say uncle. And it's important to know that the arm that is being twisted by sanctions is the civilians, or at least by overly broad ones. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do have targeted sanctions that seek to kind of leave the Russian population out of it and instead target military or perhaps the oligarchs of the country, those who kind of underpin Putin's power within the country. But a lot of what we've done has been very broad and heavy-handed. It's important to remember, just like with Afghanistan, that ultimately it's not the wealthy, it's not the political upper class that are going to be the people who push for the war. And they're not going to be the people who get punished by the war. Putin isn't going to go hungry because you've sanctioned his country. Russian citizens in the middle and lower class, the way inflation is going over there, they're the people who will die, even though a bullet was not fired in their direction, at least if this continues on, if our sanctions continue on. And we are being urged to double down on them now, even though I'm not even sure what else we could do in the realm of sanctions at this point. There could be a real history of poverty left in the wake of some of these decisions, or at least it looks like that might be where this is going as a longer engagement. That will be the long-term effects of sanctions. And, maybe they will help in ending this war sooner, lowering Ukrainian casualties, lowering casualties from a longer, more protracted war that we didn't do anything about. And, that's a view that we can talk about, and it's a view that's worth discussing. But I think that you have to think about the human cost of sanctions as well. And that's something that should be weighed in the calculations at some value. And we can argue about what that value is, but I don't think that there's any point in pretending that it has no value at all. In addition to that, you have to remember that most sanctions are effectively a double-edged sword. Sanctions often also encourage retaliation. And even when they don't, say, canceled trade relationships aren't entirely one way. So remember when Trump placed soybean sanctions on China, sure, this hurt China. However, it also hurt American soybean farmers who suddenly had no one to sell their crops to because most of their crops were purchased by China before the sanctions were put in place. And that's a sanction that isn't being levied against us. That's just the effect of our sanction. That's not even talking about retaliation. It is, though, worth considering why all of the sides thought it would be best to play out the Cold War the way that they did. I think that mistakes were made on all sides, and the way that we used sanctions were among those, the way that we even cleaned up our messes after the Cold War But I think that there's also a lesson learned that at the very least, the techniques that we used during the Cold War kept us all from dying of nuclear explosions. So it seems like we should learn from our history, be cautious, and remember that even though it is unlikely to ultimately escalate into nuclear war, and there are a lot of potentially rational people standing in the way of Putin pressing that button who thankfully aren't as mad as he is. When you talk about nuclear weapons, we're talking about the potential for long-lasting detrimental effects. And when it's a loss of that many, many lives, and it's just not something that you gamble with, even if the odds are in your favor. Also, when talking about Russia's expected ability to weather sanctions, it's worth noting that part of the reasoning has been linked to Russians' expectations of this being a 3 to 14-day conflict in total, meaning that sanctions wouldn't have time to affect their military's ability to fight. However, this underestimate of Ukrainian forces has already backfired on them on the ground, so might it also fail economically. So the way that the world is applying sanctions, the fact that we have a lot of solidarity keeps a lot of the sanctions from backfiring very directly. Because, again, you're talking about ending a trade relationship. So it means that in a lot of small ways, a lot of countries have chosen to go without in some way or another to punish Russia for this, because the effects of sanctions can be distributed amongst all of our countries, and ultimately unified and targeted against a singular country. And thus able to have a disproportionate effect on the Russian economy compared to the effects that our own sanctions are having on our economy. However, just like I said with Trump, we should make an effort to compensate Americans for the blowback, like the blowback we're seeing at the pump. There's also retaliation. The biggest set of retaliation that we're seeing right now, I happen to have written this in my car, and I had just paid around $5 for a gallon of gas, and this was like pretty early on into the conflict. I haven't bought gas since, thankfully. I'm trying not to drive, but it is steadily going up in price. So oil prices by the barrel skyrocketed almost immediately, and in fact, they had kind of been pushing the prices upward, it seems, in preparation for the war and in collusion with Saudi Arabia. So they were kind of on this upward spike before the war happened, and then they kept going up when we started hitting them with sanctions. And in some ways, this actually allows them to, through increased profit and, the solidarity with Saudi Arabia, because if Saudi Arabia kept their prices low, then everybody would just be able to go to them. But that solidarity keeps people buying Russian while also making up some of the money that they're losing from sanctions. So while we used to have a lot of power with Saudi Arabia and OPEC previously, we are losing a bit of that now. And you know what? I think it's a good time to just give it up, cut our losses, and shift into anchoring our economy in perhaps a nuclear power model supported by renewables like hydroelectric power in the short term, and focusing more on natural gas as a stepping stone into a cleaner power grid. Just moving away from oil entirely. And we can learn some lessons from Russia in that respect, actually. Russia, for their domestic power, uses almost entirely nuclear power. So they sell pretty much 100% of their oil and gas to the rest of the world to profit their country, or more accurately, their country's oligarchs. Great economic idea, except for the corruption and the distribution of profits within the Russian economy. We're increasingly seeing a green future as being impossible to avoid if we want a livable planet, and because of that, there's a large and still mostly untapped market for energies of the future. And I feel that having that as an export in a similar way that Saudi Arabia and Russia has oil will be a way that America can reasonably expand its economy in a future that actually benefits the planet and us. We need to race with the rest of the world to work to these solutions before other countries get ahead of us. And some of the political will to do so seems to be there with Biden. It seemed to be there with Obama as well. Hopefully, Biden is actually willing to fight for something that can make us more competitive with technology that the world will need to be retrofitted with in the coming decades. It is a huge emerging industry that we have to get a part of. And there does seem to be a political will for this within America, to cut ourselves free from Russian oil, not just through a temporary sanction, but permanently. And there is also growing sentiment to move away from Saudi Arabia as well. And even as I was writing this, even though people didn't necessarily realize what that was going to mean for prices at the pump, we almost universally wanted this. But it is important to notice that there will be an inflation of fuel prices. And fuel prices underpin so much of the economy because you have to transport your products a lot of times a long way, since very few things are made locally anymore. That's going to push up the prices of everything within the economy, not just what you pay at the pump. There's another way that you can help Ukraine, independent of our governments. You can send them money directly. There's a lot of humanitarian aid and humanitarian relief organizations that are helping Ukraine right now. Do some research, find out what the good ones are. Like how much of what they send, how much of what you send, they are actually sending to Ukraine, how much, the administrative fees or whatever are. Do your research, pick a charity, and send your money the cleanest way you can. Even sending $20. Like, look at what the Freedom Convoy did in Canada, even though they had nowhere near the popular bipartisan support that Ukraine is enjoying right now. And they were raising millions of dollars a day. So I think that what we're seeing is that a lot of like $10, $20, or even up to like $200 donations can really go a long way if enough of us decide to help a group out. Another thing that would really be important for a lot more countries around the world right now is to just go ahead and say that we're willing to accept more Ukrainian refugees. Unfortunately, a lot of European countries have been kind of doing this nativist thing where they've been kind of, especially the right wing in those countries, have been rallying against refugees for a number of years now. But usually the question of accepting refugees comes in relation to those whom the media has deemed unworthy victims. So some of the rhetoric on accepting refugees changes because the media considers Ukraine to be worthy victims. And quite a few countries might find themselves more willing to take in Ukrainian citizens than their darker-skinned counterparts. Right now, Poland is bearing a lot of the brunt of this refugee crisis, and that's why I think a lot more countries should be willing to provide support in this way if they can. Kind of put their money where their mouth is and say, we will take your refugees. If you can get to Poland, we'll help you get out of the country and we'll take you in hours. 100,000 people to 10 countries that are close to Ukraine could move 1 million people. And it seems like, at least early on, it was seeming like about 1 million people were leaving a week or every 2 weeks. So we need more and more countries that are willing to take in these refugees as time goes on so that no one has to deal with an influx of millions of refugees at one time. I think one of the ways that this might end that's best for everyone is that enough of the truth makes it across the borders into Russia and protests become unsustainable to put an end to while also fighting a foreign war. Massive protests lead to massive arrests and will eventually require Russia to call in some equivalent of the National Guard and or Russian military reserves. It might even force them into increased subscription, which is publicly unpopular and already will become more so as this continues. But the point is that with every troop that they have to put in the streets to quell protest and keep that shit under control is one more soldier that can't be deployed outside of Russia's borders. And this could go a long way in either encouraging revolution or encouraging the mass realization that Putin is doing the wrong thing in the Russian name. You can also potentially get to a place where the Russian military just starts saying, I'm not going to do this. They could quit. It's a thing that could happen, It's not something that you really see, but they could just say, fuck this, I'm not fighting this war. It's possible. Given the civilian consequences of sanctions and societal collapse, there are all these ways that this war could end without us having to go that route. We must be careful in how we target the innocent, even when it's not a drone that we're targeting them with. This is why informational warfare alongside of diplomacy, as well as the power of civilian protests, are so important and powerful here. because they don't rely on human suffering to come to an outcome for Ukraine. Thinking about all of our lethal aid, all of our sanctions, we must remember that while we're applying this pressure, that we should also be looking for a diplomatic way out for Ukraine as well. I would like to see Ukraine retain its full sovereignty, because I would like to see them take control of their own future. As of a few weeks in, the diplomatic offers coming out of the Kremlin aren't entirely ridiculous, but they are asking for a lot to end this. The things Putin seems to want out of this conflict are the following: Ukraine's recognition of the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as the annexation of Crimea, a binding agreement not to join any other union of nations, such as, and including the EU and NATO, demilitarization and the complete disarmament of Ukraine, which they claim to be doing now. Behind the scenes, they're also talking about allowing Zelensky to stay in power as long as they're able to... Wow. This is almost exactly season 1 of Servant of the People. Holy shit. He's in power. The Russian and oligarch-backed groups have got the prime minister in power to keep him away from doing any of the really radical things the whole season. He only realizes at the very end. And behind the scenes, they're talking about Zelensky staying on as the president, and then them choosing the prime minister and somebody who'll kind of keep him in line, and kind of leaving him there as a puppet, as the president of kind of a puppet regime that he doesn't necessarily have control over. Although that hasn't been said officially in negotiations. More recently, about 3 weeks in, we saw a second set of demands coming in from the Kremlin, and these were different in that demilitarization and disarmament of Ukraine ended up getting softened to removal of offensive capabilities, instead of, removing their ability to defend themselves or their defensive capabilities. And that the amendment to their constitution, which was previously set to keep them from joining any union of nations, and they are actually in a trilateral agreement with the UK and Poland right now, so they've already kind of violated that. They've reduced that down to just being the EU and NATO, which would allow them to stay in that agreement and also make others, so long as they are not the EU and NATO. So what this says, and we'll get more into this when we start talking about what has been happening on the ground. I'm going to go by that the first month of combat week by week. You'll kind of understand that as of 3 weeks in, Russia isn't in the same position of power they thought they were. Because things just have gone downhill for them. So naturally, they are basically negotiating from a weakened place of power. Now, how the next few days from the moment that I am recording this play out, and I should have an answer for this by the time I actually get to that video, which I won't be recording at least for another couple days until perhaps the fields in northern Ukraine have thawed, which really is... And that's something that's kind of wild about this, just how important whether or not the fields have thawed is in this whole conflict. But I should know an answer to that by the time I record that video. So as we're applying this pressure, let's remember, this is not suffering for suffering's sake. That we are doing these sanctions not to make people miserable, but to get Russia to come to the bargaining table. And yes, sanctions may play a role in this. Military and military defectors will help as well. We're already seeing this, by the way, play a key role in the fighting near Belarus. The Belarusian military was supposed to go in on day 1, but at this point that has been massively delayed, and key Belarusian officials have actually stepped down and saying that they won't do what the Russians want them to in Ukraine. However, they are still allowing Russian troops to enter Ukraine through Belarus. And the changing of the guard in Belarus might get someone who is more willing to work with Putin, although we haven't really seen a major Belarusian deployment even now. So that's good news. Ultimately, I think that all of these things just give more reason to accept a lesser outcome for Putin diplomatically. We've got to remember that while we may feel justified in supporting some of these actions, that they do have negative consequences that we should aim to end in this as quickly as possible through diplomatic means. This series has been going on for hours now, and I've still only hinted at pieces of what is going on the ground. And that's in part because I think that all of this context and your familiarity with all of these topics is going to be important to understanding how some of the people you'll see on the news moving forward will be framing this, and what their narratives are missing. I mean, you've got Hillary Clinton on TV saying that when Russia invaded Afghanistan, that didn't go well for them. And ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then admitting that there were some unintended consequences of that. Well, I'm glad you said it, but I think the unintended consequences that resulted in 30 additional years of imperialist wars, in the U.S. committing state terrorism against several sovereign governments, as well as propping up and encouraging the terrorist organizations that terrorized the other side of these organizations for a number of years. And yeah, there's a lot of fucking unintended consequences very much worth talking about. And that statement does not do credit to the situation caused by it, and I think a fucking warhawk like Hillary Clinton would know that. And I've seen so many half-assed historical references that I thought that maybe it would just be interesting to get into the history behind those remarks. There's a lot of people like her out there, pushing for escalations that would lead us eventually to a more formal war. At least for the early coverage of this, I would say that the mainstream media did a pretty good job, like for the first couple of days. Yes, the right wing was certifiably off their rockers for maybe the first 2 days, and after that, I think they polled the American people and realized that we do not side with Russia on this issue. And it's a losing battle to try to fight for Putin on American soil. So they all rapidly changed their tune, like literally overnight. It feels like the news media came together for a moment to do what it was designed for. This is kind of another 9/11 type scenario. This is another one of those, you'll remember where you were when you found out about it type scenarios. This is another one of those, the world changed dramatically geopolitically after this date and time scenarios. And again, as I pointed out with the cable media, they're really designed to operate in circumstances like this. And I think that a lot of their issues just disappeared for a moment as they took the story seriously. But over time, we're figuring out how to turn this into a cultural or political issue. Because the other end of that 9/11 comparison is to note how the media worked to manufacture consent for war as we became bored with the constant coverage of the attacks. But for a brief moment, a brief window in time, I was actually proud while I was writing this, which is a few weeks ago now. And at the time, I was also briefly proud of the Biden administration. I think that the way that Biden had reacted to the information or the laying of blame that his administration did was perfectly reasonable. And this was more or less before the invasion happened. It was an increasingly tense situation that could have been set off by the premature application of sanctions, which many people were calling for. And Biden said, as people were asking him and his administration over and over and over about sanctions, that we don't want to escalate the situation, and that we're going to wait until Putin makes his invasion clear, and we're going to respond then through sanctions, and only then. And as updates on the ground have come out time and time again, while I no longer feel that he was able to avoid the escalation of sanctions that I just gave him credit for, his administration continues to reaffirm that we will not get into a boots-on-the-ground conflict. And I think that those are all great positions to take, though they're also very geopolitically safe and, dare I say, obvious. Still, I'd been beginning to not expect the U.S. state to respond to much of anything, especially like this, rationally. And at least for a week, we did a good job. Wars, as you know, are often a fight over land or money. And increasingly over the last century, oil has become a proxy for money itself. It's through the control of oil that several imperial governments maintain their economic control over the world. America is no exception to this, using OPEC and petrodollar economics to strengthen our own currency and increase our soft power capabilities across the world. And we do this in coordination with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations in the region. Increasingly, oil is the blood of war, and it plays an important part in this conflict as well. Don't get me wrong, Russia is more likely invading for wheat than oil, or precisely the fertile land that grows the wheat. Without Soviet-era connections, Russia's barrenness has become a bit of an obstacle to its growth. After the Munich Security Council, where Volodymyr Zelensky called upon Europe to take action against Russia, Germany, being the endpoint of Nordstream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, decided that perhaps because of this they would sign an agreement with America that said that if Putin were to escalate in Ukraine, that they would turn off the newly completed Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I think it's foolish to try to say that any one particular thing led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even if the timing of it does seem strange, and I think that it was inevitable even if everyone did the right thing. However, this particular sanction is likely to have some proximate effect on the exact timing of the Russian invasion. And while I just got done giving Biden credit for not pursuing these types of preemptive sanctions, this does appear to be an exception to that. And it was met with blowback, as Russia and Saudi Arabia colluded to increase their oil prices even further to the rest of the world simultaneously, which has driven up oil prices to the profit of the Saudi monarchy and the Russian state throughout this crisis. I do want to give Joe Biden a bit of credit, though, for being willing to sanction U.S. oil imports from Russia, even though Russia doesn't make up a lot of the oil that this country imports, and even though we are a bit more energy independent than other nations, especially those in Europe. We are actually even a net exporter of energy. While he will likely be politically blamed for this as the reason that oil prices are about to go up, really most of that cause is a combination of price gouging from oil-producing nations, as well as companies within the country that are seeing this as an excuse to raise prices and thus their profits even higher. Make no mistake, watch these oil companies because their stock prices will likely go up because of this, even as American oil consumption will likely go down. It's important to realize and remember that a lot of these price gouging issues could have been taken care of by Joe Biden, and one way to do this would even be the nationalization of our oil industry, which is a step that I don't think that he's likely to take. However, it is important to note that he could do this, and it's important to note that there are a number of countries, both foreign dictatorships and peaceful democracies, that have done this to the great benefit of their people. In these states, this has enabled the government to more effectively respond to internal problems. The "how are you going to pay for it" question becomes a lot easier to answer, at least, when nationalized oil profits are high and capable of paying for a great number of public works and social safety net programs even by itself. In fact, there's a theory that I heard that I think could work very well through nationalization, and that is that there be sort of a dividend made from American oil companies that would be used to fund effectively a universal basic income for the American people off of our oil industry. And this is actually pretty similar to how a lot of other oil-rich countries do, especially the more democratic ones, where the money tends to be spread around a lot more than just enriching a monarchy, or a few key oligarchs in Russia. The most immediate benefit of nationalization, in addition to factoring out the oil lobby in the decision-making process of the United States, will be that this would give the government the ability to create price controls and factor out the types of price gouging at the pump that we are seeing today. Because, make no mistake, the majority of the inflation of the price that you are paying to fill up your vehicle doesn't come from the effects of policy, but instead the exacerbation of those effects because of individual greed.
Oil prices dropped below $100 a barrel on Tuesday, down from $130 a barrel last week. Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out the dip in costs, saying, "Why is the price of oil lower today than it was in 2014, while the average price for a gallon of gas is 80 cents more?" The answer: corporate greed.
But let's return our focus to the Nord Stream pipeline and the history of sanctions against it, which have been ongoing since the beginning of the construction of Nord Stream 1, and have been egged on by numerous American presidents, starting with Bush and, most recently, Biden. Now, all of these presidents have had a concern that European dependence on Russian oil would make them geopolitically weaker in a situation such as this. And it's worth noting that we are seeing exactly that playing out right now. Because while European sanctions are having an effect on the Russian economy and its ability to support a war machine in the long term, the most effective sanctions that Europe could levy against Russia right now are related to the oil market, and their dependence on Russian oil and natural gas is making it politically impossible for them to follow suit with America. The Nordstream pipeline in this way is a good example of the constant tension that America has aimed at Russia. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we never really gave them an opportunity to be their own state. Instead, the world largely treated Russia as if it were still the Soviet Union, which is reflected in many places, including the UN, where Russia was the inheritor of the Soviet Union's place on the Council, and also inherited the Soviet Union's powers within the United Union, such as their veto power, which they used to stop the UN Security Council from being able to intervene in this crisis, interestingly enough. And while these may not have been the wrong decisions to make at that time, this does not mean that it is impossible to imagine that the chain of events in the 1990s that could have brought us closer to Russia and could have brought Europe closer with Russia in such a way that this wouldn't be seen as the geopolitical machinations of an opposing state, but instead normal trade relations within a broadened concept of the European Union. And it should be said that Germany's actions in enforcing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline shutdown were incredibly politically brave, and ultimately the right thing to do, even if the timing could have been a little bit better. Though, part of the reason that they were willing to agree to this is that modern Germany has a dispassion for war more deeply seated than most European countries, but also thanks to them recently shutting down domestic nuclear power plants. Because of the abundance of cheap energy coming in through the Nord Stream, they are now more dependent on Russian energy than most countries, and are among the only European countries to flat out declare that it would be impossible to sanction Russian energy in any meaningful way from their country because of this. But it reminds us, all of us globally, that our dependence on these authoritarian or imperialist states for a product that we already know is damaging the world, it reminds us that our national sovereignty may be, in some way, come to rest upon our own energy independence. And while we aren't so reliant on Russian oil or gas, we are deeply intertwined with the Saudi Arabian oil kingdom. The more that we use, it makes a damn good case for all countries to seek their own energy independence. As I have mentioned here, I think that the best way to do that long term would be through heavy investments long term in nuclear power, as well as investments in future nuclear technology as well, especially those nuclear technologies that might be able to use more traditional nuclear waste, which is a problem that already exists and isn't going away, so we might as well figure out how to deal with that while we are invigorating nuclear power production. Because while it hasn't been as well funded as it could have been, research into new designs of nuclear power generation have become safer, more sophisticated, smaller, and more efficient since the world went on its last nuclear power building spree. And we can already see how that nuclear power, where it still exists, supports each nation's ability to remain energy independent and thus politically independent from these nations. Unfortunately, though, nuclear power is a solution that, even if we're talking about some of these smaller and more theoretical reactors, would take a little while even if we started building them overnight. Which is exactly why we should also start building a more immediate solution. Weather-dependent electrical solutions are not ideal because they're ultimately intermittent, and intermittency just isn't something that our energy system can rely on. However, they do have a lot of place in building out green infrastructure rapidly. As we work on longer-term solutions like nuclear power, I think another good, clean source of energy comes from hydroelectric power, which unfortunately can have damaging effects on local environments. But it is very safe and an effective form of power that can be deployed in at least a number of places. Though, while it is nowhere near as universal as some other methods of electrical generation, and to fill those gaps we should be thinking about something like natural gas, which compared to other fossil fuels burns much cleaner in terms of carbon released. And you could make your arguments against this. However, practically speaking, without things like this, we are seeing situations where we're firing up or creating new coal or oil-powered plants now, which we know are bad for the environment, but it's being done because it's a known technology and because it can be built quickly and known to perform reliably. And all of this is going to drive a lot of pushes to expand drilling. I've already heard people on the right calling for the lifting of rules against drilling in national parks, for example. I would absolutely hate to see this jewel that is the U.S. national park system destroyed in such a way for purely short-term gains, for purely short-term gains, when we could be building into long-term solutions that don't hurt our future carbon policy goals. Our plans in this regard shouldn't be either or, but more of an all-of-the-above strategy focused on increasing our national energy independence while lowering costs to the consumer and the amount of carbon emissions. And local clean power is an excellent way of killing two birds with one stone. This is also a concept that can be taken one step further. All of our basic supply chains, all of those that are most fundamental to the operation of our country, should be located within our borders as much as possible. It will take a lot of effort in building out on our part, but the prosperity and independence it will return to our country will be worth it. And to that end, I am actually grateful for Biden to address this during the State of the Union address. However, I would like to see some, firm action on how this would be done. If we do this, we have not adequately prepared for the incoming monster of increased changes to our climate and all of the unpredictability that brings. COVID will not be the last time that our increasingly interdependent supply chains fail all over the world at once. And when it happens again, it will likely be at the most inconvenient possible time. We have already seen this being incredibly destructive to our crumbling infrastructure. And these things will only get worse with time if we ignore them. But right now, it's also important to think of this from the geopolitical perspective. That one of the reasons why Russia is able to keep its economy afloat right now, in spite of sanctions, is because they can depend on our geopolitical dependence on their oil and natural gas abroad. If it were not for this, then our sanctions would be more effective in putting a quick stop to this conflict than they currently are. We perhaps wouldn't have to worry about how long it's going to take for sanctions to have enough effect to be a real deterrent. We could turn off the pumps overnight and cripple their entire economy. In a way, that would be an absolute geopolitical disaster for Putin, in a way that all of our collective sanctions haven't quite been yet. And while we're talking about Russia's resistance to international sanctions, it seems that a large part of this thinking is reliant on Chinese dependence. For example, when we cut them off from credit and banking systems that have become standard in the West, they shifted to a newer Chinese alternative to those systems, legitimizing a bipolar economic system in the world and increasing China's geopolitical power by making Russia more of a dependent state than they ever have been before, which is to say that China has a lot of power in this relationship. But also to say that while China is looking for a greater and more dominant place in the world, they're also quite happy and profiting from the current system, which they have learned how to game quite effectively. And while I am sure that they would rather have the dominant position within this system, or perhaps have their own system be dominant over the Western system, in the short term, the uniformity with which the world that China relies upon as a consumer has rallied against Russia in this conflict, making it almost geopolitically impossible for China to come to Russia's defense in a more meaningful way. And we have seen that this alliance is a lot more uneasy than perhaps Putin has assumed it to be before the conflict started. I think it's also leading to a point where Putin is going to realize that his economy isn't nearly as insulated from the rest of the world as he assumed through this relationship, and that in fact, as Russia is weakened, I believe it will become increasingly geopolitically and economically dependent on China, therefore putting itself into a similar situation that the Nordstream pipelines were designed to put on Europe in relation to Russia. I also don't think that this means that China is about to jump into Taiwan, while everyone else is distracted in Ukraine, as I have heard mentioned. I don't necessarily think that that means that Taiwan is safe long term. I do think that there are reasons to be concerned about that particular impending crisis. But I don't think that it's going to be happening soon for sure. And, I think this is turning into an approximation, and I really don't see this turning into an approximation of the Cold War, because they're not fighting the Soviet Union. Ukraine is fighting Russia. specifically fighting a weakened Russia, fighting a more globally dependent Russia. And we've all become significantly more globally dependent since the 1990s, Russia being no exception to that. They've just done more things to make the world more economically dependent on them in return.